Have you ever wondered what happens in the darkest hours of the night while the world sleeps? Today, you'll uncover what lurks in the shadows of an empty McDonald's, the long and silent nights in a hospital, and the deserted hallways of a school. Be cautious, for by the end, you might not see the night the same way again. Don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more content. Let's move on to the first story. Anyone who has worked in a fast food restaurant during the night knows that some customers can be quite strange. To make things worse, I worked at a 24-hour McDonald's right off a long highway, making it a frequent stop for truckers, cops, and anyone looking for food in the middle of the night. As expected, I had some crazy experiences with weird people, but none of those experiences had been scary until that moment. Finally, I witnessed something that truly horrified me. It started like any other night. I arrived at 10 p.m., and there wasn't much activity. It was always slow at that time. In fact, we usually got most of our customers between 11:30 p.m. and 1:30 a.m. And after that, things would slow down until the end of the shift. That night, I was hoping it wouldn't be too busy. I wasn't having a great day. My car wouldn't start in the morning, and my husband even tried to figure out what the problem was. Unfortunately, cars weren't his strong suit, so I was left without a car that night. Fortunately, I was able to borrow my husband's truck to get to work. Shortly after 2 a.m., my coworker and I were just relaxing. It seemed like my wish for a quiet night had come true. That night was one of the calmest I could remember. Eventually, my coworker went to the office to do some paperwork, which I think was just an excuse to take a nap or something. But I didn't mind much. While I was alone at the counter, listening to some music on YouTube on my phone, I heard the door chime. It was a man in his 40s. He looked like a homeless person, not because he was dirty or ragged, but because he was wearing several mismatched clothes. He was shorter than me, but I'm tall for a woman, so I estimated he couldn't have weighed more than about 130 pounds, despite the heavy winter coat he was wearing. As he slowly approached the counter, I greeted him and asked how I could help him. He just looked at me and smiled. I really wish I had a picture of that moment to convey how his expression made me uneasy. There was something wrong with the way he looked at me, something that gave me chills before he even spoke. His eyes were so dark they seemed almost black, and his mouth was open just enough for me to see his teeth, which were quite yellow. Finally, he spoke, after what felt like an eternity, and I was surprised by the deep voice he had. "Wow, you're beautiful," he said. I was thinking of ordering fries, but maybe I'll order something else. I knew it was strange and creepy, but working the night shift at a restaurant that gets a lot of customers who are often under the influence of drugs and such, I was used to weird attempts at flirting, so I just smiled and said very politely, "That's fine, sir. When you know what you want, just let me know." The man grinned from ear to ear, showing his yellow teeth again. He placed his hands on the counter, and I couldn't help but notice his long, dirty nails. I tried not to look visibly disgusted when he calmly said, "What time do you get off?" Normally, in a situation like that, I would just smile and say that I was married and move on with my life. But I don't know if it was because I wasn't feeling well or maybe because the guy had given me chills from the start. Instead, and not irritated or aggressive, I replied, "If you're not going to order food, you can leave." The man started laughing as if I had told a great joke. Before I could say or do something I might regret, I turned my back and started knocking on the office door. When my coworker opened the door, he saw that I was visibly shaken. I told him about the creepy guy who was clearly trying to flirt with me, and he laughed because he knew exactly who I was dealing with. It was a pretty common thing for us. He told me to take a break and that he would handle the guy. Without thinking, I grabbed my coat and went outside. I got into my husband's truck for about 15 minutes and just sat there, listening to music to distract myself a little. I had almost forgotten about that stranger until, just before heading back inside, I saw him walking across the parking lot with a takeout bag in his hands. I was relieved that my coworker had managed to get rid of him and decided to wait in the truck for another 5 minutes just to be sure. I didn't want that stranger to know which car was mine. When I finally went back inside, my coworker looked a bit scared. I asked him about his interaction with that guy, and his answer made me 10 times more worried. He reluctantly said he didn't know if he should tell me, but I tried not to look too concerned about hearing what he had to say. He finally gave in and said, when I came out to take his order, he just kept asking where you were. So I told him you had gone home, and he started yelling and swearing. I ended up giving him a medium fry just to make him stop talking and leave. Then he turned, and as he left, he said, "Tell Julia I said goodbye, that I'll see her soon." I nearly fainted hearing that, especially because I don't wear a name tag at this job and had no idea how this man knew my name. For the rest of the shift, I couldn't concentrate. I just kept looking at the door, waiting for him to come back, but thankfully he never did. Around 4:30 a.m., I asked if I could leave early. My coworker knew I wasn't feeling well with that stranger on my mind and that I needed to get out of there. As I was leaving, it started snowing, and it was the first real snowstorm of the season. I was grateful for my husband's truck and thought that if I drove slowly, everything would be fine, but I couldn't have been more wrong. Just half a mile from work, I ended up driving straight into a ditch because I couldn't see the road well due to the snow. I was fine, and the truck didn't seem to have much damage, but I couldn't get it out of there. So I called the police. Surprisingly, the officers arrived in about a minute. I got out of the truck to greet the officer, and then it happened. From the back of the truck, the man from the restaurant jumped out and ran away, disappearing into the darkness. I screamed. The officer didn't know what to do and started shouting for me to explain what was happening. Not understanding anything, I finally managed to calm down and explained it to him. He called a few other officers, but even so, they couldn't catch him that night. Eventually, we went back to the restaurant, and I told the police my whole story. They watched the cameras, but it wasn't enough to identify the guy. The worst part was watching the video where he appeared getting into the back of the truck. It hadn't been more than 10 minutes since my break when he ran back to the parking lot with a bag of food still in his hands, looked around for a few minutes, tried the door, and when he saw it was locked, he just jumped into the truck bed. I'm very lucky there was a snowstorm that night because if it hadn't happened, who knows what could have happened to me. His food bag was left in the truck bed, with the fries still inside. This guy didn't even want food. He knew my name from the start, knew where I worked, and knew the vehicle I would be using. This happened several years ago, and I'm still not ready to work the night shift again. Always lock your doors, and please be very careful. Some people really are monsters. Over 11 years ago, I experienced something that still haunts me to this day. At the time, I was a nurse at one of the local hospitals, working primarily in the cardiology ward. As a relatively new employee at the institution, I accepted practically any shift I could get. So many of my shifts were either during the night or started in the late afternoon and went into the middle of the night. Although I've had many interesting experiences in my career, there's one in particular that bothers me more than the others, and I'm going to share it now. In the cardiology ward, we had different visitation rules compared to some other wards. Due to the often unpredictable and catastrophic nature of the illnesses, it wasn't uncommon for approved visitors to stay most of the day or night with their loved ones. If someone had just suffered a heart attack, it was normal for someone to stay with them through the night, even if they were already stable. There was one particular patient whose partner stayed with her for several days while she recovered and awaited discharge to go home. They were very kind people, especially the patient, who remains one of the sweetest people I've ever met. Her husband, however, who was quite pleasant at first, was starting to act a little strange. I remember how he would give me a wide smile when he spoke with me or my colleagues. At first, it seemed friendly and kind, but after a few minutes of conversation, it started to feel a bit uncomfortable. Anyway, the first strange thing happened on their second night there. I was working a night shift and it was already quite late. I was in the nurse's station and saw the light blinking outside the patient's room, which meant they had used the call button to request assistance. I went to the room to see what was going on. When I got there, the lights were off, but the TV was on, and the patient seemed to be sleeping. I felt a little confused and thought maybe the patient had accidentally pressed the button in her sleep. That's when I heard, "What a nice smell," whispered right next to my ear. I jumped and let out a small scream when I realized it was the patient's husband. He said, "Oh, I was just playing with you." I hid in the bathroom, He seemed a little embarrassed when I just stood there staring at him, and he continued, "Oh, sorry. It's just that your hair smells really nice." I stood there in silence for a few more seconds, in shock, before responding, "Please let me know if you need anything or if you need help, okay? But only use the call button if you really need it, alright?" I left the room and returned to the nurse's station, which was directly in front of the elevators. That location was annoying because the old elevators made a loud noise whenever they went up or down. A few hours passed, and the elevator was making that irritating noise again when the bell rang, indicating that the doors had opened on our floor. I looked over, but no one was there, so the doors closed, and the elevator went back down. Strange, right? This happened about 5 times in a row, so I finally decided to see who was calling the elevator. I got into the elevator, and it went down to the 2nd floor where the doors opened, but again, no one was there. Tired and confused, I went back to my floor and to my desk. When the elevator returned, it fortunately stopped making noise for a while. However, when I reached for my coffee cup, I noticed a folded piece of paper. I thought it might be something I had left in one of the patient rooms or something I wrote down to remember to do later. But when I opened it, it read, "For my favorite nurse," with a small drawing of a rose or some kind of flower. I put the paper down on the desk and looked around to see if anyone was nearby. I didn't see anyone except for another nurse at the end of the hallway, leaving another room. Thankfully, I managed to stay busy for most of the night. It was almost time for the shift change, and as I was finishing up some tasks, I had the feeling that someone was behind me or watching me. I sat down in my chair and looked around. I saw a head peeking out from the door of a patient's room, or rather, a patient's husband. It was the same person who had commented on my hair. As soon as he saw me looking in his direction, he quickly ducked back into the room. I leaned my chair so I could still see the room but made it look like I was focused on the computer, and occasionally I'd see a head peeking out of that door and then ducking back into the room. I tried to ignore him as best I could so I could finish my shift and go home to sleep. That's exactly what I did, and when I returned to work the next day, I found out that the patient from that room had been discharged, and her companion with her. I was organizing my things when one of my colleagues came over and said, "I heard you made a friend last night." I asked what she meant, and she explained that when the patient's husband came to pick her up, he asked where I was and why I wasn't there. His expression changed from a smile to a frown at that point, and he just walked away. "We figured you must have made a good impression or something." I just smiled at my coworker and went back to reviewing some charts, trying not to think about why that man had been so interested in me. Heis exactamente eso. Y cuando regres al trabajo al día siguiente, descubrí que la paciente de esa habitación había sido dada de alta. Y con ella el acompañante. Estaba organizando mis cosas cuando una de mis compañeras se acercó y me dijo, "Escuch que hiciste un amigo anoche. Pregun que quería decir y me explicó que, cuando el esposo de la paciente fue a buscarla, preguntó dónde estaba yo y por qué no estaba allí." I work at a very small school, with 3 or 4 classrooms for children. The classrooms are on the lower floor of a church, and my job is to clean them every night after classes. Usually, it takes me about 2 hours to clean all the rooms, but since I work the night shift at a nearby supermarket, I usually get to the school around 10:30 most nights. Something you should know is that the church shares a parking lot with a nursing home that's right across the street. I have to admit that many strange things have happened at this school at night, but the strangest happened about a week ago, and I'm going to tell you about it now. I had just finished cleaning the 2nd room and was starting to move all my cleaning supplies to the 3rd room. It was probably around 11:45 at night at that point, which meant I was a little behind schedule. So I tried to hurry. As I walked down the hallway toward the 3rd room, I heard the church bell ringing upstairs. No one had ever shown up during any of my shifts before, as it was always so late and both the school and the church had been closed for hours. I was a little nervous, so I slowly walked up the stairs toward the door. It was one of those wooden doors with large dark glass panes. Trying not to be seen, I peeked around the corner of the door to see who was outside. I saw an elderly woman, probably in her 70s or 80s, standing outside the door. Retreating before she could notice me, I decided to ignore her. I figured she was just wandering a bit far, and one of the nursing home attendants would come to get her soon. I started cleaning again, but just a few minutes later, I heard knocking in the hallways. I was startled and stopped to listen. The knocking stopped for a few seconds and was followed by the old woman shouting outside. It was hard to understand what she was saying, so I ran upstairs, where I could hear her more clearly. She was calling for someone named Ella, repeating the name several times. As I got closer to the door, the woman stopped. I peeked around the corner of the door again, and she was no longer there outside. I turned and started to go back, but out of the corner of my eye, I saw the old woman staring at me through the window right by the stairs. She looked me straight in the eyes and shouted, "Ella, help me." Her eyes were wide open, and her hair was long and gray. Now I could see her more clearly. Immediately, I ran back downstairs, locked myself in one of the classrooms, grabbed my phone, and called the nursing home, explaining the situation and asking if perhaps she had escaped from there. The woman on the other end of the line told me that everyone was accounted for and that they would have noticed if someone had left because they were required to check before anyone went out. She said she would check with security and asked me to stay on the line in case they needed more information. While I waited, I heard more knocking at the window upstairs. A few seconds later, the woman on the line described the elderly woman's features and asked if that was the person I had seen. I confirmed and mentioned that she kept shouting the name Ella. There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line. I got worried and asked, "Are you still there?" The woman told me not to open the door and to find a safe place to stay until she could send someone to pick her up. Obviously, this made me even more terrified. I asked what was going on, but she just avoided the question and told me to stay in that safe place and wait. So I did. I stayed in the room, listening to the knocking upstairs nonstop. The building was quite old, and I didn't know how long those windows would hold up if she kept pounding on them. Finally, I heard some voices outside, and after a sound that seemed like a struggle, the knocking stopped. I sat there for a few more minutes, just thinking about what had happened. Then I got up and tried to finish cleaning the rooms. The whole situation felt unreal, and knowing that the old woman was still in the building across from me made me really nervous. I never found out who Ella was or why that old lady was so desperate to get into the church, but I'm glad I never opened the door. Thanks for watching until the end. If you enjoyed the content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe so you don't miss any new and terrifying videos.